Thank you. Let me just get physically situated where I'm going to stand. All right. How are you all doing today? Good. All right, good. All right. So thinking about rats and mice, this isn't something most people are excited to talk about or think about. But if you think about the arc of human history, both modern and past, during antiquity, across geography, so no matter what continent you think of, or no matter what time period, let's not even think about land. Even when it comes to seafaring, there was always this one type of creature that always seemed to hitch a ride and be in those different places. And that is rodents, rats and mice. And so I think of rats and mice, rodents in particular, as one of the most pernicious and tenacious commensal, in other words, these non-pet animals, but that are still very familiar to us in humanity. All right, so why does science in general care about rats and mice? And so I'll spend this talk talking about the four main things that make science, that makes rats and mice overall interesting to science, and to me in particular. All right, the first thing, they save lives. Biomedical research really owes rats and mice, laboratory rats and mice, a great debt of gratitude. 95% of the laboratory animal workforce are white mice and white rats. Cultivated over 100 years ago from nuisance rats and mice caught by rat catchers, developed into the fancy rat breeds that you may see at the pet store today. These different, now dozens upon dozens of strains of rats and mice are what make it possible for doctors and scientists to thoroughly research and understand not only how diseases work, their mechanisms, but also appropriate treatments from everything from diabetes and metabolic disorders, cancers, heart disease, even cognitive and psychological issues. All of these things we owe a great debt of gratitude to laboratory rats and mice, because we use them as model organisms to understand the mechanisms of these diseases as well as to evaluate possible cures and treatments. Even for the giant pouch rat that I work. So let me give you a little background about the African giant pouch rat. It's a large rat. If I measured it from nose to tip of tail, it's about 2.5 to 3 feet long. It can weigh up to about 4.5 pounds. And it's called a pouch rat because they have these adorable cheek pouches, much like hamsters. And this rat can save lives as well, but not like the biomedical research animals, but through their ability to smell problematic chemicals. Century pouch rats have been responsible for detecting landmines, returning over roughly 33 million square meters of land back to nations in Africa and Asia. So in these war-torn parts of the world where they used to formerly bury explosive devices in the ground, so landmines. And so now that countries are either turned away from landmines or they're trying to reclaim this land, because this is precious farming land. This is precious land that could be used for roads or building hospitals. It removes all this available land to some of the most the nations that need it the most, particularly developing nations. And so pouch rats have been involved in detecting landmines and helping demine countries such as Angola and Mozambique in Africa, as well as Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam in Asia. But that's not all they're good at smelling. They can also detect the bacteria that causes the respiratory disease tuberculosis. In 2015, 1.8 million people died from TB. TB still impacts about 10 million people every year. And since around 2014, pouch rats began training to detect the active bacteria in sputum samples. So when people go to the doctor suspecting that they may be sick with TB, they give a sample, they cough and spit into a sample. The pouch rat can actually smell that sample and determine if the bacteria that causes tuberculosis is in it. And in 2014 and 15, pouch rats screened over 300,000 samples and identified over 9,000 cases of TB in patients in Tanzania and Mozambique. We care about rats and mice because rats and mice can save lives. They also entertain us. It may not be a big deal here, but rats and mice are really, really popular pet creatures. And if you include their cousins such as gerbils and hamsters and chinchillas and guinea pigs and other exotic animals like dagoos and chinchillas, if I didn't say that already, there are a lot of pet rodents out there. They're adorable. Look at that. Even pouch rats. So this is one of the pouch rats that I work in Tanzania. This is a juvenile. This is not an adult. And so I wouldn't do this with a wild animal, but this was a juvenile that I had been handling. So that animal's only about 8 weeks old, roughly. And pouch rats are actually really, really popular pets in the UK. They have their own little society of people who study pouchies. Really adorable. So rats in particular are very social. They're very, very smart. This is the smartest rat in the world, in my opinion. I know they weren't the basis of the movie, The Secrets of NIMH, but I am convinced they are the rats of NIMH. Super brilliant, super dexterous, can get into things. We have a colony here in the United States that I brought back, and we always had around 3 or 4 rats that were just always good at breaking out of their cages continuously. No matter what we did, they were always jailbreaking. You had a question?
Did you bring a pouch rat today?
Did I bring a pouch rat today? I did not, and I'm gonna tell you why in a moment. So this is one of the reasons why I didn't. So not just my rats, but all rodents. They can spread diseases. That's one of the other reasons we care about studying them. This is just a short list of the problems and diseases that pouch rats can cause. That rats and rodents and mice can cause. And these aren't things that exist far, far away. Hantavirus is something that is actually something we have to be mindful of even right here in this region. But many of these things we kind of think mostly, so Lassa fever is something that my pouch rats carry. They actually carry that, as well as leptospirosis. But that's something all rodents can carry, and this is particularly a problem in rural areas. And all these other really nasty sounding things, you don't want that. This is a combination of things that some things we can treat with bacteria and with antibiotics and with quarantine, but there are other things there's actually no treatment for at all. Nothing at all. You can't do it. There's nothing for that. Not really much for that. Anything with hemorrhagic, that's, I hope you know Jesus. There's nothing he can do for you. Not much we can do for you. And so all in the plague, the Black Plague, the black rat was incorrectly vilified for hundreds of years for causing the Black Plague. We now know that it wasn't primarily responsible, but it was still involved. The fleas that lived on the rats, in other words, they were vectors of it, so they didn't necessarily have the disease themselves. So whether they directly cause disease or indirectly cause disease, rats can make us really, really sick, rats and mice. And in particular, and so you'll notice in all places, so even right here in St. Louis County, rat control is one of the very first things most municipalities get to going. That's one of the first offices many municipalities start. And it's even right here. Rat control and rodent control is so important that here in the United States alone, we spend over $300 million in professional rodent eradication services. As private citizens, we spend over $25 million in rodent control devices, so the traps and the baits. This is a big business because they have always vexed us. And this is why, another reason why I didn't bring one. In 2003, not far from here in Chicago, there was a monkeypox outbreak, so right here in this region. And the culprit, the African giant pouched rat. And they talk about it right there. So the African giant pouched rat. And since then, it has become illegal. So you cannot bring pouched rats into the United States except for very, very, very special, highly vetted circumstances. And I'm the only person who's been able to bring some in the nation since they successfully bring in a nice colony of pouch rats since this rule was instituted. And there's no chance of this rule being lifted anytime soon. They also have been known, rodents, to cause crop damage. Perhaps some of the earliest experiences of humanity of dealing with rodent problems has been with the turn of when humanity started focusing on growing our own food. So not only do they cause crop damage, in other words, while it's still on the stem, while it's still still outgrowing, but it's also a problem, particularly worse, once folks harvested things and they brought them into those storehouses or in the granaries or even into your cupboard pantries. Rodents can get into things, they eat it. And even if they don't eat and consume it all, when they leave their droppings or urine, or just when they touch it and leave little fleas behind, wink wink, the Black Plague, it can cause sickness and pestilence. So it destroys our food and our ability to take care of ourselves. Here's a pouch rat kind of perched on top of corn. They really like grain. Most rodents do. And in Tanzania, where I do my work, rodents like the pouch rat and even smaller field mice, so little field mice, Natalinensis, they cost about $45 million in damage in Tanzania alone. It compromises anywhere from 5 to 15% of the nation's corn crop, which is one of their staple crops. And in developing nations, when that happens, this isn't just simply an inconvenience. This is a matter of life and death in a lot of places. So rodents, tend to think of them all over the place. And so we have this mixed relationship with them. They've done amazing things, and keep them as pets, and they save lives. But they also have this horrible history of vexing us. And so for both of these reasons, this balance of we love them, they're useful, they vex us, they can harm us. Both of these are reasons, either singly or together, for understanding why we need to understand more about them. But this isn't the first time. We have a long history with rodents. If you think back to the story of the Pied Piper, that was a rodent infestation story based on an event supposedly in the village of Hamelin, Germany, that they were so overrun with mice and rats that a flute player, he could mesmerize these rodents and lead them out of the village. And then upon not paying their bill like they promised, he then spirited their children away. But these are folklore stories that have been with us, and there are traditions of similar stories across many cultures about rats and rodent infestations, and also stories of plagues and pestilence. This has been a part of our folklore and storytelling for hundreds and hundreds of years. But why do we care about the urban ecology of rats? And I would posit this is also a part of our literature. The childhood story of the city mouse and the country mouse, or the town mouse. We've always had these stories about rodents, and urban ecology isn't new either. This age-old, this childhood story of cousins, one living in the country, one living in the city, and how they make a living very differently based on their surroundings. How they both dealing with predation and finding enough food to eat and finding a safe place, dealing with rodent control measures, the risk and reward of living in different environments. Essentially, I'm doing a scientific study of town mouse and country mouse. And these aren't old issues. You notice the date here, December 2016. Paris is dealing with one of its worst rat infestations in the last 4 decades. Places, or the monuments such as the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Chambly, all of these areas are now becoming more overrun with rats. They're now investing so much of their dollars to keep these places clean for tourist purposes, but the city is suffering like it's never seen in a long, long time, all because rats are taking over again. So this is a perennial problem. So what do I mean by urban? So let me just ground you a little bit. So what we call gradients is anything that kind of goes from plus to minus, so from a little to a lot. And in the context of urban gradient, we mean places where we've built up environments as people, so buildings, and we've removed a lot of the green space. And then we have this like suburban areas to urban areas. And keep in mind that rural areas have been developed as well. It's just we use these places very differently. They tend to still be green, but we changed it from the point of view of the native vegetation. So it's still modified, but it's modified differently. And then we have these non-developed areas. So we have everything from the most natural areas, let's say historical remnants in parks that we haven't touched, so trees we haven't cut down for hundreds of years. A good classic example of that in this area would be those old remnant areas in Bellefontaine Neighbors. That's a historical remnant. Or those historical remnants at Calvary Cemetery that they haven't touched. Those are historical remnants that haven't been touched. So they give us a snapshot. We can literally time travel by going into those areas to see what the ecology was like and to see how animals are surviving with all this change happening around them. And then rural areas, we have right here in this area. If you go just a little bit north on 67, we have actual farmland and open land. And then we would qualify this area as more suburban, but it kind of fills right between these two areas. And then centralized, so think of downtown St. Louis, where there's a lot of buildings, very, very little green space. And so what I do is I want to understand how mice, if you think of country mouse and town mouse, by taking a snapshot of different neighborhoods, so finding places to study animals, I want to know which species of mice live throughout this entire continuum, and how might they be making a different living. So if you think of that story of country mouse, town mouse, how one was more laid back and one was more like snazzy and sophisticated, can we find animal correlates that kind of correspond with these behavioral differences along this urban gradient? And so I talked about that already, this idea of city or town, but there are formal definitions based on how many people are around, as well as how many building or built up areas. And so you get into these confusing places. Let's take East St. Louis, for example. It's a highly built up area, but it's not a lot of people who live there. And so it's one of those areas that's weird. It's like it simultaneously, depending on whose definition you use, could be rural as well as urban. So it's important to remember it's not just how many people are there, it's also a combination of the people and how much we've changed the environment without buildings and structure. So why study this idea of ecology in an urban setting? So first of all, it means it's novel. So the presumption is so much of the science, and think about all the science shows that you watch. We make this presumption that the natural areas or rural areas are the kind of foundation, that's the default. And so we've been ignoring really places where animals live. Animals don't just live out in the wild or in the country or on the other side of the world. It also looks at the impact of animals. In other words, these animals live in concert with us. Their lives, even if they are making a living off of us, still represents valid wildlife ways of life. And they've been traditionally understudied because of this presumption that it's unnatural or less natural. Urban areas also provide unique laboratories. Because we haven't studied these areas very well, they're wide open. In other words, it's wide open opportunity. And one of the amazing things you get to do in science, you can continue the work that other people have done, or you get a chance to do something brand new or relatively new that no one else has touched. I kind of like doing that part. And so I like the idea of pioneering in a place where everyone has overlooked and taken for granted that either we already know it or it's not interesting simply because of our common day familiarity with it. And this one perhaps might be the most important. This is where the future growth and resource abundance is. Cities now account for a higher and higher growing percentage of people of populations. By the year 2050, they're estimating that 70% of the world population will live in urban centers. This is where the people are. This is where the science is. So studying our environment now to understand what we're working with gives us the information we need to make better decisions for urban planning, for preparing and staving off this balance between the benefit of rodents as well as the negatives or the cost of living in concert with rodents. But let's not forget that there's also a historical legacy to urban living. We talk about urbanness in very modern terms, but let's not forget, St. Louis has always been a big city. Cahokia. This was like the New York City of pre-Columbian Indian society. This was a major urban area. Think back to that definition of urbanist, when you have a high density of people living nearby one another, terraforming and changing their environment. Cahokia Mounds represents one of the most vibrant and sophisticated urban communities here in the Americas, pre-Western European contact. So there's always been a history of urban living. And no doubt in my mind that they were vexed by rodents then. And there are even archaeologists who study human civilizations based on the rodents and their lifestyles that live near them, that they find their bones in the trash heaps. So much of our most important information about change over time has been from pack rat nests. Pack rats, those are rodents. You know, these rodents that we think of as stealing things and holding on to them. Pack rats have essentially been used as natural history time capsules for how people lived, because they take these little things and we get these little snapshots into how different cultures live. Rodents have always been our most pernicious, uninvited, familiar animals. And so the ways that we approach urban ecology, we can either take our traditional training in ecology, so working in the great wild, looking at the relationship between how organisms interact with their environment and with each other. So think of like food chain, food web interactions, predator-prey interactions. So that's what we think of in ecology, like so how animals interact with one another in their environment. And we can take these same questions and now go in neighborhoods or go in brownfields or go in alleys and actually ask these exact same questions. And we can look at urbanization, in other words, that gradient that I told you about, and how the species compositions, in other words, which species of rodents actually live where. And if they all live there, look at their difference either in their numbers or their abundance, or how they behave and interact differently. In other words, how they divide up the habitat to make a living to avoid each other, as well as to avoid us. So this is me in the field in Tanzania. And so I work like I work in rural areas and as well as in villages. So I've been looking at these questions very unintentionally for a long time. So I trap and I work with rodents in the wild. So now I'm starting studies at SIUE. We have huge acreages. We have over 2,000 acres, and I'm able to do studies outside on our property, soon to expand throughout the St. Louis metro areas, or where I actually trap. I collect data on the animals, and I do behavior tests, and I release them back into the wild if I'm able to. The average farmer does not want me to release things back. But I do behavior variation studies. In other words, I look at animal personality. And so I look at things that they're exploratory behavior. In other words, how much they move around when they're exposed in new spaces and old spaces. Are they sniffing? Are they grabbing things? Are they manipulating and playing with things, chewing them up? I want to understand neophobia. So neo means new, phobia means afraid. How likely are they to interact with things that are new or not? And why is this important? Well, rodents, one of the reasons why they've been so successful around the world, making a living, no matter how many millions of dollars we spend to kill them, is because they're really good at eating most anything. In ecology, we call that generalist feeders. They'll eat most anything, and they can make a living out of most any type of thing. So they'll grab little things and make a little nest, so they can hunker down using the minimalist of materials. And we think that when animals live in cities, because they're constantly exposed to so many new things, so loud noises, new buildings, pets, all these things, this idea that perhaps what we're actually selecting for when animals are successful at being around us are animals that are able to dampen that fear of new things and exploit it. Because generalists, animals that eat most anything, have to be willing to try new things. They got to get new food. But there's a risk with eating new things. Because what's one of the first ways that we use to kind of kill and combat rats? Rat poison. And so guess what? There's this baseline behavior in rodents that we assume about all of them. And it's called bait shyness. This idea that rats overall won't eat new things. So how does that work? You're a generalist, but you're afraid of new things. And so from an evolutionary point of view, rodents are always kind of making trade-offs and taking risk. Like, do I risk eating something new and it might be poison? Or what if I can't find the things I want to eat? Or but the space between what I want to eat and and where I am, it has too many traps out there. It's too many predators, too many house cats. And so animals are always having to play this juggling game of how much do I risk? How bad do I need it? How hungry am I? How bad do I need to run to get away from predators? And so what we can study across this urban gradient is this idea of your fear of newness. How much risk are you willing to take when you encounter novel things? And we're also interested in how does this relate to their genetic dispositions. In other words, when different species behave on two different levels based on who lives where or who doesn't live where, and then we can look for individual differences. Maybe just some individuals stand all the way out and many that don't, and just are reticent. So looking for these, not just behavioral differences and environmental differences, but also looking for clues for what genetics might be able to explain about this. And so these are two of my primary subjects, so prairie voles, which you can find around here, and other vole species, and this is the African giant pouch rat that I study in Tanzania. And what I mean by behavior, in other words, personality, you have to think of how you behave is based on two things. In other words, the situation you're in, so that's context, and then over time, are you doing the same thing over and over and over again? And so when we think about behavior personality, we're asking questions not just in the snapshot of what we see right now, we're asking about how you're likely to behave consistently over time. And if I put you in different situations, is there still something about you that is consistently bold or interactive or hyperactive? And so it's like looking at multiple dimensions at one time. And so my overall research objectives, both with the Tanzanian pouch rats as well as the field mice I study locally, is I want to understand the natural history. And natural history is the basic behavior before manipulating things. I just want to understand the baseline background, how you make a living, ecology and behavior, and where you live, of different species that occupy habitats along urban gradients. So I want to study animals from everywhere from the deep part of the city out to the suburbs, to the rural areas and the historical remnants, all right here in this area. And I want to examine their behavioral differences of these rodents by giving them multiple behavioral situations many, many times. Because the questions I'm asking primarily is, which species live where? You know, we may not have the exact same species living in the cities as we do in the suburban areas versus the historical remnant areas. So which species live where and which ones are the most abundant? And then after understanding who lives where and in what densities or abundance, well, what is it about their behavior differences that makes some species successfully live, in other words, make a living across these urban habitats? So, you know, if we find, which we're likely to find, house mice that live all across, it doesn't matter where you go, you'll always find house mice. But maybe it's the abundance of them. It's different. How are they competing with their neighbors, you know, to make a living? Their numbers could be smaller because there's other rats and mice out there that are just better at making a living than they are. Keeps them from taking over. And the opposite could be true about in the city. So how are they making a living to explain their behavior differences, to explain these differences in abundance and success? So I do things like look at open field tests. So for the pouch rat, because it's so big, I have to use large rooms. But the same test like the little mazes that you see at the Petco. Same kind of questions, the scale is different. And this helps us understand exploratory. How much do they walk around? How much will they explore and interact with these little novel objects? Will they push them around, jump on them? All the little things that you imagine mice do with little toys. I even had one rat, so this is a room. It had climbed up and climbed all the way up. And I looked for it, and it was hanging on a curtain rod that was only this big. They are really good. I look at the different mazes, so labyrinths. So how do they behave when I put them in a labyrinth? Can they find the treats that I'm hiding in there? Do they get bored and give up and go, I don't care? So all these little things that I'm able to measure their behavior. Different types of navigation mazes, you know. Even when I don't put treats in there, do they just hang out here or do they explore the entire maze? So I'm able to look at things like total distance traveled, how many pauses they take, how many turns and alternations that they take. All these little things add up. And if you would imagine, if this isn't a device, this is a field out in the country where they have to look for food, or they're looking for places to hide, or trying to search out mates. How they explore these novel areas give us hints into how they exploit and pioneer new areas for themselves. And so I'm overall asking a question, just like I study across urban gradients, I'm looking at their gradients of behavior. And so I'm essentially asking, along this continuum, where does each animal lie? Are they less exploratory? I'll hang out, not really interested. You've already kidnapped me, lady. There's nothing much I want to do for you. Or are they very exploratory? Are they proactive? In other words, the moment I open up, the bag and let them out, do they bolt off running, or do they hold tight and they kind of collect some information and then make a move? Are they anxious? In other words, are they more likely to be very springy and jump, try to bite me? All these little things add up to understand, because as animals and these things don't necessarily have to go in the same direction. You can have an animal that's very low on exploration, but amazingly proactive and not very anxious. So these things don't even have to be coupled together. So dealing with these complexity things of how these animals are responding to things. And these things help us understand in the urban point of view. So we're worried about rodents spreading diseases and contributing to asthma. Well, if they're very exploratory, very proactive, and not very anxious around us, these are the ones that may get into your home, carrying things to make you sick. These are the ones that are likely to exploit and take over that abandoned house or that abandoned field down the street very, very quickly. So it helps us decide, how do we handle these nuisance rodents? But it also, from the point of view of the ones that we care about, either as pets or research animals, well, if they're very if they're very anxious, they might not be suitable for working in the lab, because they're so afraid. They're so busy trying to bite the handlers that they can't be used for helping us explore cures. They just can't be handled. So we have to, understanding these basic things helps us make decisions for either of those reasons for studying them. And so how I measure that, so think about the test I give. And so the science part of it, it has to be something I can measure. In other words, I have to be able to count it, have to be able to measure it, have to tick it off on a paper. And so I'm looking at measures of how they use their time when I put them in these novel places. So for example, do lower latency or higher latency. That just means how soon you do something, how much time you spent doing something, the frequency of behaviors, whether you do it a lot or slowly, and how much space you use. You can have animals that they may have moved the entire test, but they never move more than a foot instead of using up the entire room. So what's the relationship between just activity, moving around, and actually checking out new things? So it's this combination of things that you have to measure to get a complete picture. So it's all these different dimensions of trying to understand what animals are doing. And so if you think of it this way, let's say I caught a mouse and I put it in an open field. And then I gave it one of those tests where it has to, decide between the left and right side, or any other test where I'm getting to measure how they spend their time in this test, whether they leave the starting gate fast or slow. Even if I just look at that one measure, once I open the door, how much time it takes for them to leave. Well, if they have a consistent personality profile, well, all three of those stars ought to be grouped together. In other words, if they have a personality type. But if the animal is very flexible, those stars can be all over the place. And so it doesn't mean that the animal isn't interesting. That means that they're so variable. In other words, we can't narrow down their personality to say one thing about them. Their personality is they're hard to figure out. And that may be to the animal's benefit. So if you think like a mouse, there's always something trying to kill you. These humans are always putting traps out. They have cats, they have dogs, there's foxes out there, weasels. We got owls at night, hawks in the daytime, snakes, shrews. Everything's trying to kill me all the time. And so it could be that flexibility is what makes them so successful. But all this is still that brand new stuff we're trying to figure out. Like, so what makes these urban animals so successful? Is it because they have a consistent behavior, or is it their inconsistency that makes them successful over time? And so what I do is I do essentially the same thing over and over again, whether I'm working with big rats or the little mice. And that's because really focusing on the basics is, one, my passion. And I like to remind people is that this basic information isn't all known. There's so much biology that we're still discovering, even on animals that you see outside your door every day. You'd be surprised by how little we actually know about the details of how they make a living. And even if we know something about their species, it's good chance that we don't know anything about their species in the context of an urban environment. All right, so this is me working in the field. So I partner with Sokoine University in Tanzania. And so this is me handling a pouch rat. They are big, they do bite, and so we have to have a special little sleeve to hold them in. And it takes, on average, 2 grown people to handle this animal just to get basic measurements. And when I say we don't know much about most animals, the pouch rat, we're still learning basic information about them. So this one I have here to show you an example. One of these is a male and one of these is a female. But because there was not a lot of published literature and I was unfamiliar, I thought both of these were males at first. And so when we don't have basic information, we can make the wrong call. I was making the wrong call. And for the nonprofit that's been training these animals for the last 15 years, they've had the hardest time breeding them. Because we didn't know, not knowing basic information. And what I learned, so this is a young female, they don't actually, until they're mature, if they don't open up. In other words, they're not open and ready for mating until they get about a year of age. And this is still data we're still trying to really narrow down to get the exact window. But because most rats only live 2 or 3 years, and we know they become sexually mature usually by the time they're weaned, so we're thinking 5-6 weeks of age, we kind of just added a few extra weeks. Oh, they're bigger, so they'll just take a little bit longer. I was able to, so the rat you saw on my arm, I was able to bring that rat and a couple other rats back that I knew exactly when they were born. So I knew exactly how old they were. And we kept them away from males, so they weren't mating. And we measured those animals, and it's still not a complete study. Those animals were over a year of age before they finally sexually matured and opened up. And these were animals living in captivity, getting plenty of good food, getting plenty of good health care, and it still took over a year. And usually whatever we see in captivity is happens faster than we see in the wild, because they don't tend to get as heavy, because one, they have to run for their lives, literally, and they're dealing with more infections, so their body's doing a lot of things. And so all these mysteries still abound. So from the point of view of science, we can't use these animals effectively to help us if we don't know the basics about them. And as a scientist, particularly if you're interested in studying new things, discovering new things, it's just to remind you, there's so many new things out there still waiting to be discovered. Even those things that are right up under your nose. And so just like in the last 100 years, thanks to it started with the working men who caught rats for a living, and then it became formalized in science. We now literally have textbooks about the biology of laboratory mice and rats. I'm hoping to start to do what we have to do to create similar volumes for other wild mice and rodents, starting with the African giant pouched rat. And this is some pouched rats. And so we've been able to, so I was able to successfully bring some animals over for a colony. They are residing Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, so they're not here in this region. If they lived in this region, if they happen to get out, one of the concerns beyond the healthcare issues is primarily agriculture. This is a really good agriculture region. And if they got loose, they would make an amazing living here with no natural predators. And since they live most of their lives underground, they could probably hide out successfully and populate at will before we finally become wiser to there's a problem going on. And there's actually a small invasive little outbreak in Florida. And everyone's been keeping an eye on that for the last 10 years. Thankfully, they're kind of isolated on the islands. The fear is if they ever make it to the mainland. Florida, habitat, and ecology and weather-wise is not a lot different than sub-Saharan Africa. It would be awesome for the pouch rat if it got loose. And we've been able to have a few babies, and this is some of my babies. This is a baby actually born in Tanzania. But that's to show you, one, they're adorable, right? They're adorable. But rats and rodents provide some amazing opportunities for us as researchers and for humanity, science and society. So this is my little bit, to show you rats are awesome. And so the question is, why do I study urban ecology of rodents? Well, I do it because I like to do science where I live. I enjoy traveling. I love those shows, the National Geographic, Wild Kingdom. That's why I became a scientist. That's why I became the kind of scientist that I am, which is an ecologist. I do science to travel. But there's an amazing benefit to being able to do science right where you live, outside your back door. One, it's accessible. It's needed, and we've been overlooking it for the longest time. I want to do science that matters to many people for many different reasons. In other words, understanding rodents matters to farmers. Understanding rodents matters to those of us who live in the cities and suburban areas for different reasons. But this is science that matters. We have rodent control centers. We have, this is a vibrant industry. And so I like knowing that the science I do actually serves and meets society's needs immediately and meets them where they are. I like sharing science and engaging everyone in the scientific process. Like I talked about those shows that I loved as a kid, I loved them, but I didn't see people who looked and sounded like me. I like the fact of doing science in my neighborhood and demonstrating that everyone can do science, even if there hasn't been a traditional media presence of women or people of color or folks from urban areas, folks with southern draws like me. Everyone can participate in science at any level. And it's also my little mini plug that once everything's up and going, I invite you all to help me out. If you know some great spots here in the city that you're like, my cat's always bringing in things, I want to know that. I want to know where the hot spots are. And the best way to know these hot spots is to start reaching out to you. And if you got kids who are like always bringing things home, that is a natural historian in the making. Don't stop them. They can come out and help me in the field, my junior field assistants. It's awesome. And I enjoy what I do. So I did not set out to be a rodent researcher. I became a scientist because I wanted to study those awesome, amazing beasts like lions and wolves and things. And I was like, how did I end up studying mice and rats? Because they were there. And they have provided me an amazing, rich opportunity of research that I have enjoyed immensely. So I'll be sticking it out with these rodents for a while. And like I said, it's plenty of unknown information. So it's plenty of room at the table for everybody. And I'm trying to encourage as many people as possible who want to participate in science. And let's learn more about rodents together. Thanks. Yes.
Have you tried keeping the male and female close together, see if that changes it?
Actually, yeah, that has been, yep. So that's been one of our interim experiments that we did. And so our colony is so small, so it's kind of harder to tell. And when we didn't, in that small sample size, it didn't necessarily change it. It does seem that
it has an effect to it.
Well, maybe not, but it does seem like the most important thing is that they just have to get old enough. In other words, the developmental cues seem to be the first thing that they have to pass. And so what this means is that the age of puberty is just longer than we ever predicted. Yeah.
But just keep in mind, in humans, the biological father in the house makes a difference in the maturity of the girls.
It does,
So,
but in some, and we know
Is it
in,
male or is it biological?
so that's the thing, with laboratory rodents, we know that's true. Laboratory rats.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's going to apply to all rodent species. So they may all look alike, but they can be vastly different. And that's one of the things that we are not absolutely sure about with the pouch rats. We don't know their mating system. We're not sure if they're monogamous or not. Now, we've placed males and females together singly, but there's also been some breeding experiments where they'll present a male with 2 females, and everything seems fine there. So my field data suggests that males and females don't live together, but it's still such a small sample. Males, so in other words, when I trap them, because I'm repeatedly trapping them, I'll catch the same animals over and over and over again. And I seldom catch adult males repeatedly in the same place night after night. Now females, night after night after night after night in the same area, suggesting that they live there. This is their home. We'll catch females and smaller subadults. So we've never been able to catch little babies, which lets us know that they don't come above ground until they get mature. And by mature is about almost a kilo. Now what I know in captive populations is that they get to a kilo at about 8 months of age. So it's like they're living, so that's my question, like, are they living successfully underground, nonstop, several months at a time? No one would have expected that. And so what I need is better toys. So when I return next year, I'm trying to go with remote sensing material so that I can like penetrate the ground with images, just to figure out where their burrows are. And then maybe I'll get a little RC car and spy on them. But like, there's still so many questions and no answers. And so, are the males living there? We don't know. Yes.
Sorry, I raised my hand at the wrong time.
Oh, okay.
Did you swap up the time of day that you looked for mice in the wild habitat? Or?
In the wild habitat. So I've done everything from continuous trapping, so 24 hours. So when I'm doing continuous trapping, that means I'm checking my traps every 4 to 5 hours. So I'm going out there every 4 to 5 hours. And if I'm only there for a short period of time, I'll do it that way. If I have more time, like, so now that I have a place to live and I can sit still, I only do it at night. You can catch things in the daytime, but for the most part, you don't catch as many things in a day unless it's cloudy out. Animals, you do your best trapping a couple hours before the sun comes up until about a couple hours after it goes down. So let me stop that. A couple hours before the sun, about an hour after the sun goes down until a couple hours, about an hour right as it does. So dusk to dawn is really your best bet. If you have more time to spend, so where you can catch them, do your test, and then release them. But so that's because nothing wants to be out. Nothing comes out on hot days. Nothing. Everyone's taking a nap. Yes.
With the pouch rats being so dexterous, do they ever break out of the traps or find a way to?
Yes. Well, so the traps they're pretty good at. They can't really get out of that. They'll chew on them. What'll happen is if they get really panicky or anxious animals will move so much that they'll physically jump and make the trap move. I've looked for a trap and it was like a whole meter away because they jump so much. And you have to be careful because they tend to live near cliffs. So I have to be careful that they don't tumble over. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned that the rats and mice come out like dusk to dawn. So during the eclipse, are they going to come out?
You know what? Folks are saying that. I'm in no position to test that because I want to see the eclipse. I want to see it. No, but it also depends on how long. You know what I mean? So by the time they get the message, is the sun gone by then? But I am tempted to put some cameras out. The problem with working with little bitty things is I can't put a camera. Well, I can do a little GoPros and then I risk them walking away Because bigger things be like, what is this? It's a snack. I'll take it away. So yeah, but people are saying that they're gonna all like start going to sleep. I don't think it's long enough for them to switch their little clocks to start taking a nap. So you. Yes.
But the eclipse is going to be around 2 hours long if you count the partial.
Well, if you count the partial, but I think the part where it really, like, I don't know if it's gonna last, like it's not dark long enough, you know what I mean? The first half hour and the last half hour are just gonna feel like an overcast day. And animals don't necessarily come like all the way out. So overcast days you can do better in the daytime, but it's still like, it's a combination of things. It's a combination of how hot it is outside, how long that kind of overcast or cloudy lasts. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
So, do the local people in Tanzania have any use of these grass?
So, in a few more rural parts of Tanzania, they eat the rat, but mostly, so as it was explained to me by my Tanzanian family, we are Tanzanian, we don't eat rats. But it's very common to eat them in West Africa. West Africa is really, really popular. And so the rats that are popular in the UK, so that's a different species. So it's multiple species. So the ones that come out of West Africa are the ones that became the pets in the UK. And I had a very small colony of the western ones from Ghana and the ones from Tanzania. Now just to look at them you can't tell, but now that I spent time with both of them, they look different and behaviorally very different. The ones in West Africa are much nicer and easier to get. And I'm told that trapping them in Ghana and Nigeria is much easier. In Tanzania, it's hard. Like I spend a lot of time. I work with a lot of folks. So even before when I know I'm going to Tanzania, I go ahead and place a call 2-3 months out to start trapping, because it takes a while to get them. In Ghana, they just they make it sound like you just go outside and scoop them up. How folks talk, but yes.
So just the difference.
I'm sorry. I'm listening.
The difference just being nicer, or they have any.
Physically, yeah, they do look different. So the West African ones have a more grayish look. Their noses aren't as long, but it's very superficial. I mean, it's the average person be like, it just looks like a pouch rat. But I can tell. So the Tanzanian ones are more chestnutty brown and much, much longer noses. Like their noses are really big. And these guys are mean. I mean, the West African ones aren't a beauty contest, Miss Personality. But having handled both of them, I can tell a Tanzanian rat from a Ghana rat all day. Like, yep, you are not nice. Yeah. I saw another hand somewhere, maybe?
I have a question.
Yes.
That New York Times article about rats in Paris blame the European Union.
I saw that, yeah.
Why? Why blame the European Union?
I don't remember what all they said. I think it has something to do with their policies as far as what they're allowed to do as far as the trapping and checking commercial freight, but I don't remember that because I was focusing on it from the point of view of more recent examples of rodent infestations.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr.
Thank you.
That was really fascinating.